Hello, my name is Sam, and my thesis is called The Human-Machine Loop, a Tale of Architectural Absorption. Throughout the history of art and architecture, the tool of the narrative has formed the basis for a number of works, giving a richness and depth to the practices. Often these works are drawn from fictional and non-fictional stories, leaving the element of representation up to the artist. In a similar way, this project challenges traditional notions of authorship in the design process by interacting with a text-based AI platform to formulate a continuously evolving narrative in conjunction with an evolving process drawing. The initial phase of the research process resulted in a series of 5 drawings, each paired with their own written narratives based on personal experiences. These narratives were shared with the AI to calibrate its responses, initiating a baseline for an extended conversation. As the conversations continued throughout the project, selected segments from the dialogue were utilized as a basis to represent the present state of the narrative process. Through this sequential interaction, these narrative interpretations were transferred from text into a visualized composition. This project ultimately challenges traditional notions of process, emphasizing the impact of AI interaction as an extension of our own creative thought, and its potential to play a critical role in the field of design. So as you can see, this thesis is about drawing, which I've had a deep interest and drive for since before I attended architecture school. Before I attended UB, I had been partial to analog techniques, but I've definitely branched out to digital methods, which you'll be seeing some examples of today. I think these 2 drawings by Tom Main and Daniel Liebskin really introduced me to what an architectural drawing can do outside of the realm of the standard plans and sections. Ever since then, I've spent a lot of my free time in the past 5 years looking into various artists and architects, watching lectures, listening to podcasts, and experimenting with drawing for fun.
Amidst a world in which the human form has been reduced to nothing more than an energy source, humanity is forced to exist within the confines of a vast system of interconnected machines. These humans occupy the structures of the architecture they once resided in, where machines are now housed from exterior conditions. Within this system, the extraction of knowledge, intuition, and power from the humans is conducted through a series of machines that operate within this remote civilization that has succumbed to their own technological forces they created in the name of preservation and sustainability. The extraction process is carried out by a machine that interfaces directly with the human brain, extracting knowledge and experience from their life before they were connected to the system. This knowledge is then transmitted to a projector that interprets the data onto a surface made of light, creating an abstracted visual representation of their experiences. This visualized data is utilized to transfer this information from far distances to various machines to further increase operational efficiency. As the human race remains entrapped within the confines of this machine-dominated world, the intricate system of interconnected machines continues to thrive, consuming and utilizing the knowledge and experience of the humans to further its own pursuits.
So that was an AI-generated narrative produced from tens of thousands of words of dialogue between myself and ChatGPT. For my directed research semester, I primarily spent my time narrative making and drawing, while also looking deeper into the works of architects and artists who have taken similar approaches. As I'll bring up later, this cycle shifts with the introduction of AI. This diagram that I've used for my own understanding illustrates a series of currents within architectural discourse in the past several decades. Architects, projects, movements, universities, and ideologies are organized in relation to one another, thus positioning the flow of these elements in a stream of thought relating to my own project. Developing a language through drawing is something I've been experimenting with over the past few years. Everything from entirely analog to entirely digital, trying to utilize familiar elements, architectural elements, and representational strategies to compose both self-directed and studio-driven drawing projects for communicating concepts and working through ideas. The work I'm presenting today is a direct continuation of this. In order to understand where my work fits into the conversation, I've written this taxonomy that I use to define the underlying subjects of the precedent works I've researched. These classifications might not be how these architects would define their own work, but I use them as a framework in relation to my own project. Just to flip through some examples of this narrative-based work from art history, The Raft of Medusa by Theodore Géricault translates this story from the survivors of this disastrous event into a visual representation. Another example of this is Pablo Picasso's Guernica, as a politically heavy work created because of the bombing of Guernica, Spain. Also, given the vast history of biblical paintings and their narratives, the removal of the body of St. Mark from the 16th century depicts the stealing of this body from Egypt to later be placed in a tomb in Venice. Looking at another example of work based on real events, but with a speculative future-based narrative, Lebbeus Wood's radical reconstruction proposition for Sarajevo in War and Architecture, he proposes that salvageable structures should embrace a new way of living by reconstructing the scars of war by stitching itself back together utilizing debris. In a project by Masahiko Yendo, who was a student of Lebbeus, Self-Sustaining Urban Living Units proposes that in a post-industrial world, that these abandoned machines must be repurposed and reconfigured for housing units. Yendo here is using this observation of abandoned factories and envisioning a speculative future condition. Through my own personal observations on the abundance of 5G cell towers mounted on all kinds of structures, I developed this drawing on an exceedingly invasive iteration of these machines, which can be referred to in your handout called Cell Tower. In this drawing set by Douglas Darden, the project Auction House takes on the fictional narrative based on a character from William Faulkner's novel As I Lay Dying. This client is a disabled signalman for the South Pacific Railroad on a site in rural Mississippi, and his house was designed to function as a sepulcher in which he was confined to. Darden really devotes the project's narrative to this occupant and his own conditions, which informs the architecture and ultimately enriches it. Through this fictional client concept, and from feedback from a reviewer, the drawing called Genetic Modification explores this idea of a house designed for an individual whose body has been altered to their own preferences, but no longer functions in a traditional residence. Another drawing classification is what I'm referring to as the drawing. Often it is used by professionals who are trying to work through ideas, scattering their thoughts on a page. Perry-Culper is an excellent example of this position of the subjective drawing typology. So this is a true story that helps orient the direction of this next narrative. One day, a tree-cutting device controlled by a man with a tablet appeared in my yard and chopped down the one pine tree in my front lawn. This drawing, called Self-Reversion, builds off of this concept by repurposing this machine as a device that removes technological growths from malfunctioning nanotechnology. Oftentimes, architects attempt to take on the task of representing abstract principles such as time and space. One of them is Beatrice Martin, where most of her work is on the graphical constructs of architectural representation. She writes about her work, "The narrative is assembled as a montage of verbal and visual constructs, and routing in the form of mental frames. This includes a graphic exploration of cognitive processes and their visual representation, a structural mapping of mental space through frames and folds of memory, as well as the tectonic field in which the psychoanalytic encounter between narrator and narrative takes place on a drawing." Inspired by an abundance of targeted advertisements appearing on my phone, this drawing called Dreamcatcher is about an infrastructure that harvests subconscious thoughts for advertisement purposes. Another is the work of Brian Cantley. In his Palimpsestuous Relationship series, he refers to organized religion as one of the first social networks, and then this drawing mass as the emergence of patterns as social media starts to expand into everyday consciousness, and the power of one perspective being accepted as truth. From reflecting on this conversations from one of my seminar courses, the virtual environment drawing then explores the role of the home in conjunction with a fully virtual presence and its effects in relationship to the dynamics of space. And so transitioning into the thesis semester, I set out to utilize AI as a primary methodology as a way of experimenting with the use of a third party to influence the narrative process. As I mentioned in the introduction, these narratives were fed into the software as a baseline in order for its dialogue trajectory to head on the right path. After asking it to produce several more narratives based on these narratives and the other information from the previous semester, selected segments which held interest to me were taken and expanded on. Beyond a purely question and answer relationship with the AI, I have begun to treat it more as a conversation, and also consulting with it in regard to media and process, which tend to spark more provoking responses. The narrative has become more of an alternative reality in which details are articulated to a greater extent, which the AI is able to remember as the single conversation thread continues. As the drawing sequence moves forward, I consult with the AI with narrative specificities and almost everything else related to the drawing. So this is the structure of the project. The thesis is about the process drawing. The primary methodology is narrative production through text-based AI collaboration and the discernment of the generated prompts into drawing. And some of the underlying themes are the history of the process drawing and the narrative drawing. The drawing being the dominant output of the architect and these dystopian future / science fiction narrative themes. So in the case of this thesis, drawing is both the subject and the methodology. Up until recently, AI has been developed for something to compete against rather than something to collaborate with. For example, in 1997, the first IBM computer named Deep Blue won its first game against the world's best chess player, Garry Kasparov. And then more recently in 2016, the machine learning software called AlphaGo took on the world's best Go player, Lee Sedol, and won 4 out of 5 games. More notably, the AI produced a move that has likely never been considered in the 3,000 years of Go's existence, which the experts refer to as extremely creative. This is possibly an original instance in our history where creativity has been used to describe a technology, which I think is pretty fascinating. So my initial hypothesis is that just like collaboration with colleagues, moments within the dialogue will spark creativity in either myself or the AI. While ChatGPT isn't itself inherently creative, the strategy here is to feed it limiting criteria that forces it to come up with an answer within the range I set it to. I see this as a tool, sort of a colleague rather than a way of reflecting on my own back on themselves. The chatbot in this project has become more of a mediator between myself and the drawing surface, rather than the drawing directly from the narrative I've authored. As for documentation purposes, I go back through the AI dialogue and highlight moments where inspiration struck in blue, and other moments that help give context to the blue highlighted text in yellow. The many pages of dialogue are given a more concise framework to understand the conversation this way. So for a sample of this ideation process, I've taken some excerpts from my conversations with ChatGPT. This first example from the AI reads, "To cope with the scarcity, humans have developed the ability to merge their physical bodies with the structures they live in, becoming one with their surroundings. This has enabled them to conserve resources and avoid waste," which I thought was a peculiar notion to consider for the narrative, so I moved forward with it. Sometimes the text it generates isn't completely logical, but in this case, it helped me think outside of the realm of logic for a minute, which was beneficial. ChatGPT already knows that in this story, the humans are embedded in the architecture, but it suggested that they oddly still have transportation systems. This provoked me to think, why would they need this then? Perhaps then they need to be moved. Why would they need to be moved? Perhaps they are the power source for the architecture, and they need to be relocated to another site where they can be kept alive and continue to generate energy. So this was the dialogue for the preceding conversations after this excerpt. A lot of the criteria for the narrative I have to adjust because the AI can get fixated on certain things. So I have to remind it to get rid of some ideas. One of them was that the humans were embedded cellularly into the architecture, which wouldn't make sense if they were being transported. This excerpt from the AI reads, "The merging process is achieved through a mechanical system that attaches and detaches from the body, from the architecture. The system allows people to plug in to a designated port in the structure, which can be found in every room or public area. The attachment is achieved through a set of metal rods that extended from the architecture and enter the body through small ports in the skin, which determines that the process is mechanical rather than cellular." The AI has been really helpful in generating the many components of this narrative by adding complexity and depth to it. I've also been digitally modeling the machines we discuss as I interpret them, similarly to Franz Kafka's In the Penal Colony machine, which artists have interpreted from text to imagery over the years. So as a reflection, this tool has been something I found sparks changes in my thought patterns, which often deviates me from a track I would ordinarily go on. I think the one thing it may lack is the ability to directly disagree with me and be critical of ideas. However, it is helpful as a way to talk through things without the need of someone physically present. As a way of grounding the project, I tend to consider ChatGPT and the produced narratives as the site of the project operates within, and the interpretation or discernment of these elements as a methodology of construction. While these narrative drawings that are produced generate a loop of intuitive compositional inquiry, like the title suggests, the AI dialogue's path is more linear, which is why the process being a collaborative effort is important. While the process could hypothetically continue endlessly, I have decided the sequence can be stopped here for the sake of clarity. Thank you.